Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our final panel of the day. After this panel ends, we'll tell you a little bit about the plans for tomorrow morning. But for now, I want to thank you for a terrific 2 days. I wish I could have gone to every single session. I wish this were continuing for several more days. I really thank you all for being here. One of the great pleasures of planning this conference for me has been organizing a panel that brings amazing people from Boston to the stage to talk with us about the work that they're doing on affordable housing, gentrification, and displacement. And we have the great honor of having Tiziana Dearing, who's the host of Radio Boston on WBUR, here to moderate our conversation. She's been a commentator and contributor to WBUR for more than a decade and has contributed to a number of other regional and national news outlets. Prior to joining the Radio Boston team, Tiziana was a professor at Boston College in the School of Social Work, where she taught social innovation and leadership. A longtime anti-poverty advocate, Tiziana also ran Boston Rising, a startup anti-poverty fund to end generational poverty in Boston, and was the first woman president of Catholic Charities. So I thank you so much for being here, and I thank our panelists from the bottom of my heart for being here. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I join you in looking forward to learning from our panelists. Let me just give you a quick look at how this is going to go. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give you a quick introduction to themselves and the organizations with which they work. Then I'm going to ask you to do a quick shout out to us of the things you're most curious to learn about in our limited time together. From there, I've given the panelists one question for them each to think through and give a 1 to 2 minute answer on, and then we're going to move into discussion from there, mindful of the things that you've just told us you're most interested in. Depending on how that discussion goes, we may or may not move into Q&A from the audience towards the end. And we'll try to finish this at around 5:50 p.m., just so that you know exactly what to expect. So let's quickly move into introductions. Japonica asked our panelists to introduce themselves. So Mike, if you could briefly introduce yourself and your organization.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Leyba. I use he, him pronouns. I am a co-executive director at City Life Vida Urbana. City Life is a 50-year-old community organizing group based here in Boston and Jamaica Plain. And we do organizing work. We work with community, particularly who are facing evictions or foreclosure, to stabilize their housing, to stabilize communities in the process, to build new community leaders. And really, our goal is to build a social movement for housing justice in Boston, in Massachusetts, and even across the country. I am not from Boston, although I do have a working class family background with various kind of levels of housing stability in my family. I grew up in Los Angeles, but I'm really honored to be here with you all to talk about gentrification and displacement. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mike. Next to Lydia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia. I go by she and her, and I'm the director of the Chinatown Community Land Trust, which started in 2015. Prior to that, I worked for 30 years at the Chinese Progressive Association, which is a grassroots organizing group, kind of civil rights organization that works for tenant rights, worker rights, voting rights, and all rights. We do a lot of, so the Chinatown Community Land Trust does a lot of organizing around housing policy, direct organizing with tenants who are at risk of displacement, and we're acquiring existing housing to preserve as permanently affordable housing.
Before you pass that microphone, do we have a second one down there? Is there? Great. So why don't the two of you share that one? Great. In fact, if there's two more, let's share the wealth. Let's bring them all up here. There we go. Kathy, go ahead.
Is this on? Yes. Sorry. Yeah, hi, I'm Kathy Brown, and I work at the Boston Tenant Coalition, and we're a coalition of tenant housing, homeless, and community groups working around housing policy to try to get more low-income housing and stronger tenant protections and preserve housing.
Great. Oh, no.
And I live in Jamaica Plain in Boston.
I guess you guys have to share that other one.
Okay,
then. Thanks.
that's great.
They did listen to explain. Apparently, there's a certain number of microphones you can have active because of the acoustics in this room, just so you know. Go ahead, Taylor.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Cain. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Chief of Staff over at the Boston Housing Authority. We were established in 1935, and we have 63 development sites across the city of Boston. And in addition to the brick and mortar public housing that is kind of very iconic, I think, both in Boston but in other cities, that brick is, you know it when you see it. We also offer vouchers that allow folks to access housing on the private market, and that is something that folks can use in the city of Boston, but also around the Massachusetts region. I come to this work after getting my PhD in sociology right here at BU, and decided to leave the ivory tower for working in another institution of local government, and have learned a lot in that space, and really excited for this conversation today.
Thank you, everybody. So if I could just take a second, please, and literally just shout them out. Things that you would be interested in hearing from this group over our time together. What are you interested in hearing about? Capacity. Great, thank you. What else? Resident organizing, thanks. What else? The policy landscape. So we've got capacity, resident organizing, policy landscape. What else? Anything? How community land trusts work. Great. What else? Anything else? Rent control. Rent control. What works? Funding. Best ways to reach people. Best ways to reach people. Great. So that gives us kind of a sense of some things that we can touch on as we go. Thank you, folks. And we might check in with you again in a little bit, depending on how fast we get through all of those. So the question that I had you prep two questions, and we sort of figured I'd pick one of the two when we got here. I think the thing that I'd like to pick is, what do you see as the greatest legacy contributor, and let's say public policy, right? Legacy contributor to gentrification in Boston. So over the last, you pick 30, 50, 100 years, the greatest legacy contributor to gentrification in Boston. And let's go in reverse order now. So Taylor, you're already holding the mic. So we'll start with you, and if you could just 1 to 2 minutes to answer that, and we'll come back down this way.
Yeah, this was a hard question to think about because I think there's so many things one could choose from around what is the largest indicator or legacy in Boston. But what I was reflecting on is, I think in Boston, and again, similar to other cities, the dispossession and devaluation of land belonging or shaped by communities of color. Historically, we think, or communities of color and also low-income communities. So the West End and the destruction of that community, the fight around the Southwest Corridor, but the loss of homes and businesses that were owned by communities of color to make way for now what is a beautiful, maybe you all will see that if you do this tour tomorrow, but the Southwest Corridor, which is this incredible park that connects many different neighborhoods in the city of Boston. There's a walk path, there's a bike path, there's public transportation underneath it. So now it is this incredible resource, but when you think about who benefits the most from that now, it is communities that have rapidly gentrified over time, and that historic investment was built on the backs of communities of color that no longer get to fully enjoy that space. And I think those moments in history where I think the collective we, in terms of government, in terms of market investment, signaled that this land isn't valuable, and it's not valuable because of the communities that currently live here. That legacy continues today, so that now we're in this kind of game of catch up, where we're trying to preserve these enclaves that we have in different neighborhoods across the city. I think of places like Chinatown. I think of places in Nubian Square, in Upham's Corner, where we have kind of remaining communities of color that are threatened by these market pressures that continue to exist. And that's really built on the backs of that these places were historically disinvested in and devalued because of who lived there.
And just to note, Nubian Square used to be called Dudley Square. It is one of the places that's also on the visiting list, I believe, for tomorrow. Thank you. Let's go to Kathy.
Okay. So in terms of the legacy contributor, for me, it's market-based housing. Because where housing is for profit versus for people, and that feels so fundamental to the housing crisis and just the larger market system. And we now have no controls on rents, though we're trying to get that back, which I think people talk about. The huge racial wealth gap and housing wage gap. And just so many families, disproportionately people of color, being, pushed out of their homes, out of their neighborhoods, far, out of Boston, sometimes out of the state. And then seeing, as you can see, a lot of massive luxury development, which just, further pushes up rents, and it's not being built for Boston people, and especially families. And then I guess just and investors buying up housing and small businesses being pushed out, but also just the intersection of some of the housing history, housing policy, especially the intersection of race and the market, and thinking about who got homes through the GI Bill after World War II, and white people, not people of color, and redlining by the banks, and exclusionary zoning, where what kind of housing can be built, or racial covenants about who you can sell your house to. So it just feels like all of this history and the underfunding of housing, especially the federal government. For years not investing in public housing or in other affordable housing, so and housing discrimination.
Thank you. Lydia.
Yeah, I guess I'd echo what others have said. I think that the whole system has just been totally hostile to our people from the beginning. The U.S. tried to exclude us, tried to pass every law possible to prevent people from being able to make a living, build wealth, or own land. And then when people banded together and created, in our case, Chinatown, as a safe haven from mob violence and exclusion in an unwanted area, because those communities were never respected, the interests were never considered, there's always been sacrifice of our communities to some greater economic development good, whether it was urban renewal and highway construction, whether it was institutional expansion, that ate up half the land in Chinatown, whether it was, taking the unsavory adult entertainment district away from City Hall and putting it in our community, and then finally luxury development, which is all about bringing other people back to live in downtown Boston and, forget about the people who are there. So, everything. But I think that, in particular, in more recent times, zoning, and how zoning is totally geared towards the profit of, developers and not towards the needs of communities. So we are dealing with the luxury development boom and all of the fallout and displacement because of untrammeled, development where zoning has meant nothing to speculative developers.
Mike. What everybody else said. I guess just kind of building on points, I do think in housing especially, but in land use generally, there's a fundamental contradiction between something that's like an asset value and what is the use value of the land. And we need to be able to think about and analyze building projects or new development from both perspectives And right now, and historically, I think the greatest legacy has been that historically the prioritization of of capital value of the land has been prioritized far more than the use value of the land. And so because we're at a university, I did some research. And no, but I brought, a couple years back, I read this book called Capital City by Samuel Stein, and he makes some really shocking data points in here. It says, I'll just read a couple of sentences. Global real estate is now worth $217 trillion, 36 times the value of all the gold ever mined on Earth. It makes up 60% of the world's assets. The vast majority of that wealth, roughly 75%, is in housing. There's a number of reasons why capital is converging on land and buildings: a long period of financial deregulation, low federal interest rates and quantitative easing, I don't know about that anymore, massive urbanization programs, et cetera. In the United States, homes are changing hands at a rapid pace, but homeownership is at a 50-year low. In 2016, a record 37% of home sales were made to absentee investors. As renting rises, so do rents. Average move-in rents in the United States have more than doubled in the last 2 decades. So just one. So the prioritization of market value, of trade value, of asset value over the use value of housing as something that is fundamental, foundational to our well-being as humans, as human beings. And this is played out over time in a lot of different ways. For banks, it's played out through redlining and reverse redlining, where particular mortgage products are being targeted at or against, away from communities of color to protect the asset value of the bank. For landlords, it still is common that we have no-fault evictions or dramatic rent increases where rents can literally double from one night to the next without any fault or any reason or justification. For government, there's an incentive to preserve the asset value of land because it's what the city and government often draws on as a tax base, right? And for investors, there's a fair return standard because there's such a common understanding of land and housing as an asset. And I think the historic lineage of the biggest problem is that this is prioritized over everything else, when in reality, we literally need land, in order to live and survive and have access to schools and healthcare and jobs and voting and.
So let me just do a quick check-in. How many people in the room right now are from the Boston area or know a reasonable amount about the city of Boston? So a little less than half. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do next. I'd like to take a few of the terms and the ideas that we've talked about, that I've heard you talk about on the panel, and I'm going to ask you to clarify them a little bit for our broad audience, all right? So let's begin, Taylor, with urban renewal, right? Just the quick summary. When we say urban renewal, that means something very specific here in Boston. Tell people what that was.
Well, so I can say what when people say urban renewal in Boston, I think the things that come to mind are what is now known as the Boston Planning and the Boston Planning and Development Agency, formerly known as the Boston Redevelopment Agency.
Authority,
yes. Alphabet soup, but the kind of key entity that played the role of taking land through the course of urban renewal in Boston.
Yeah. Go. Yeah. Keep going.
Oh, keep going. Great. Well, what else do we want to say about urban renewal in Boston?
Okay. So I will jump in there. So basically, a super fast, the whole area that is sort of City Hall and areas around that used to be where people lived. And there were a whole set of neighborhoods that were raised for progress to build both City Hall and the areas around it, and a set of highways that then turned into a congestion nightmare that then turned into the famous Big Dig. That used to be where people lived, more low-income people and people of color. So that's what we mean here when we say urban renewal. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that is fair.
Great. When we say redlining, Kathy, that was we talk about redlining, but that was a total thing here in Boston. Do you feel like you could talk a little bit more about that? Do you feel like you know a little more, or does anyone else on the panel feel like they could talk just a touch more about redlining in the history of Boston?
I could talk a little bit, but then...
Great. Let's do it.
I mean, the concept of redlining is, where the banks would lend and where they wouldn't lend. And the redlining was actually where they would draw red lines around communities of color, not good places to give loans. And so people didn't get loans. And white people did. Do you want to add more?
No, it was intentional. We literally have in our archives maps of this city with actual red lines drawn on them that were boundaries that the banks decided, both where loans wouldn't be given or where loans would be given only to people of certain races. And we actually have the documentation evidence of that in our city.
And both urban renewal and redlining was a national phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's just that it had particularities here.
Yeah, but it's also specific to our city. Now, we had somebody shout out community land trust. So give us a definition of what a community land trust is and how your community land trust works.
So community land trust, the first community land trust in the US actually started out of the civil rights movement in the South when a group of people decided, because a lot of black farms were getting, people were getting dispossessed of their land. So it was to actually organize and own the land collectively in order to remain and thrive. A community land trust basically is a form of nonprofit where the community owns the land collectively. And by owning the land collectively, you preserve the things that are important to the community. So it could be natural, it could be farmland, it could be businesses, or it could be housing. And usually with housing, there are 99-year ground leases and that's the legal mechanism by which you make sure that housing gets preserved as permanently affordable.
And somebody shouted, I almost hate to say the words, but somebody shouted rent control. So why don't you tell folks, Mike, how rent control, just briefly, how rent control ended in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and where we are on it right now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Sure. Well, rent control, if you don't know, here in Massachusetts, there's no regulation on how much rent can increase from one month to the next if you don't have a lease. And so we used to have rent control here in Boston, in Brookline, and in Cambridge up until the early 90s. And in the early 90s, the real estate industry, there was a trend around deregulation, and they saw rent control as a barrier to them being able to profit off of the land to the extent that they wanted to. And they put rent control on a statewide ballot here in Massachusetts, as well as in several other states around that time. And here in Massachusetts, 351 cities and towns across the Commonwealth got to vote on whether those 3 cities were able to keep this policy. Unfortunately, it was a narrow loss. And so now, not only do we not have rent control, we also have a ban on it municipally. So we can't enact rent control at a city level. It all has to be done through the State House. So that's where we are today. And I think kind of today, if you go to the State House and ask folks, what's the biggest problem? I think people will talk about housing affordability. And there's a lot of difference on how do you actually address it. And even within rent control policy, there's a lot of, it's a broad range of perspective on what is useful or what is not useful or what is helpful and what is not. And so that's very much an active live conversation today and into the future and last week, just generally.
And nearly 30 years later, 29 years later, there is now a new ballot measure on the ballot for less than 2 weeks from now that would allow cities and towns once again to enact certain forms of rent control in their cities and towns in Massachusetts.
There's nothing on the ballot right now. They're collecting signatures for a ballot question. So it hasn't qualified to be a ballot question yet. It will be a ballot question in 2024 if enough signatures are collected and the process is followed.
That's right. And right now it is polling. The most recent poll done less than a week ago has it polling at above 60% favorability in the state?
It's polling very high, and 60% is around the number. Even if you look at like particular demographics, for example, there's a large poll of Latinos done statewide that showed 78% support for rent control. And on the other hand, on the other side of that, the real estate industry has no interest in trying to let us have rent control, and have pledged tens of millions of dollars of spending in disinformation and organizing campaigns to defeat it.
So now, take us into your organizations and talk about solutions that are most important from where you sit. Policy solutions or financing solutions, because we heard both policy and funding. Policy and or financing solutions from where you sit. And whoever's ready to go first, go.
So I was actually recently at a conference in Toronto, and it was so refreshing because this provincial authority got up and said, the most affordable housing that we have is the housing that we already have. And I was like, yes! But that's what nobody is talking about here, in our political discussion. And so I think that we really need to do as much as we can to keep the housing that already exists and keep it affordable. And there are different kinds of policies that will help us. We have a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act that's before the state legislature that will go to a hearing before the Joint Committee on Housing on November 14th. We're actually planning to have a rally demanding tenants' opportunity to purchase for a lot of at-risk tenants in Chinatown on November 13th to highlight that policy. And we need more funding. We are actually very happy that in this, the governor's bond bill recently proposed a lot of money for affordable housing compared to the past, including the ability to impose a transfer fee as a way to continue to raise money. But the money that exists for affordable housing, for the most part, it's really geared towards new construction of new affordable housing, which we definitely need. But it's actually cost less. It results in less trauma and displacement for us to keep people in the homes that they already have. And we just need to have that as a really important part of our housing policy and our funding and our work.
Could you briefly explain transfer fee?
Yeah, a transfer fee just means that when a property changes hands and it transfers, that you can impose a fee on that as an additional way to raise money. Yeah.
Kat, you look like you were ready to jump in.
Been working on that transfer fee. But anyway, really, really great tool that it would be great if we could get. Obviously, as Lydia spoke, the most getting housing out of the market is number one, like land trusts and, permanently affordable housing. There are something that we've been working on that's sort of newer and potentially very exciting is using fair housing policy, and specifically using under Obama, the Fair Housing Act that was passed after Martin Luther King was murdered it was interpreted very strongly in terms of cities and towns that get government funding have to affirmatively further fair housing, not just like not discriminate, but take steps to really address race and for protected classes. And there is some great work going around the country, and actually Boston passed a very interesting zoning bill, and that was able to do locally, because so much, as we talked before, you have to go to the State House, like to get transfer fee, to get rent control, to get so many things, you have to go to the State House. So wherever we can use like local strategies, we have power, and zoning is one of them. And so much of zoning, as we've talked about, has been used for the bad, for the displacement, for the segregation, et cetera. But there is this zoning amendment right now that we have that says developers, when they're developing housing, must affirmatively further fair housing. And obviously that's a stretch, but we are trying to, train more people to know about this and use it and press the city to do what the law says, is development needs to affirmatively further fair housing. So that's been kind of a more exciting tool that we're looking at, the Boston Tenant Coalition, a lot.
Mike Taylor, who's next?
Yeah. So at least in our work, I think all of these policies that have come up are really important to us. Rent control, of course, is an important one, and a combination of rent control and just cause eviction. Yeah. Here in Massachusetts, again, we can allow eviction for no fault of the tenant. That's pretty unusual. I just also wanted to shout out one other kind of hot off the presses kind of issue. There's a couple of organizers in the room who I know. I just want to point to. Well, Kim is over here, but Minnie and Nicole over there. And in Nicole's neck of the woods in Somerville tomorrow, there's a rally around rent control. Flyers. Not an event if we don't have flyers. But one other policy that's really active right now is just even the right to, in Massachusetts we have a right to shelter. It's something that is kind of fundamental, the right to shelter. I love that quote of like, the most affordable housing is the housing that we all have access to, and that's true for shelter too.
So I'm just going to pause you for a second.
Yeah.
Massachusetts is the only state in the United States where families have a right if they are homeless. The state is obligated to provide shelter. New York, the city of New York, but I don't believe it's the whole state. Am I incorrect about that? It's the whole state? Okay, all right, great, sorry, keep going.
No, and the thing that has been challenged right now is, the right to shelter program has been providing housing, and even the way we define it is pretty narrow here. It's only for families with children that are experiencing imminent, homelessness. And recently, the governor has kind of announced that there's an intention to create a waiting list for this right to shelter. And so the question is like, do we really have a right to shelter if there's a waiting list and you're being denied shelter because you're on the waiting list? And so like just a fundamental like, what are we doing here, guys? Yeah. Like, do we have a right to housing? Do we have a right to shelter, or do we not? And if we choose one of those, affirmatively, then I think we would be making a whole different set of policy recommendations, which include these, but really would fundamentally transform the way we view land and housing.
And that waiting list essentially goes into effect Wednesday, November 1st. Anything you want to add on that, Taylor?
Yeah, I think a helpful piece to kind of add to this, because I see the Housing Authority as kind of a way of kind of bringing all of these different pieces together in terms of thinking about right to housing, a right to shelter, in terms of thinking about how do we maintain what we already have. And I also think at the Housing Authority, we have a waiting list of over 30,000 households that are waiting for housing in the city of Boston. So there's a very clear need for more housing, more funding for affordable housing. So I say that because I think at the Housing Authority, we think a lot about our existing housing stock. Boston is pretty unique in that we have public housing in almost every neighborhood across the city in terms of like built infrastructure. And in Massachusetts, we have both a state public housing system and a federal public housing system, which again is kind of pretty unique. There are only a few other places that have that combination. But that housing stock is aging. A lot of it was built in the 50s. It was built for a very different way of living. Some of the units themselves are very small. Many of them are not accessible. They were not built in the mindset of like ventilation and airflow and all of the things that we think about now in terms of housing. So I think there's a lot of energy and focus on thinking about how do we improve our existing housing stock and really make sure it is meeting the needs, but also like matching the dignity of the residents that call that space home. And so that's what we spend a lot of our time thinking about at the Housing Authority, while also thinking about how do we do more. Boston Housing Authority has this capacity to build an additional almost 3,000 housing units that would be funded by the federal government, and we are really invested in thinking about how do we increase the amount of public housing that is available in the city, because we know that is meeting a need that is going unmet in the market.
So I'm going to take a very quick pause. We have about a little more than 20 minutes left in our time. For you poor people who are sitting where the sun is directly in your face and it's killing you, there are other chairs where that is not the case. And you should feel very comfortable to stand up if you would like and move to one of those other chairs. You will not offend anybody if you're moving around and getting the sun out of your eyes while we continue our conversation here. You're welcome. If anyone else wants to do it, feel free to shift. One of the things that's on my mind, and I noticed that there was a panel discussion on it, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, is the intersection of climate and gentrification. There are a couple of things that are on my mind unique to Boston on that. One is we have an entire area that's just been millions and millions and millions of taxpayer dollars spent to develop the Seaport District without an eye towards affordability, and which will probably be flooded in a matter of years because of climate and sea level rise. We also have a housing stock, both regular housing stock and affordable housing stock, that is old and not climate ready. So talk about this intersection between affordability, gentrification, and climate and housing, and how your organizations, your tenants, your advocates are thinking about those things. Anybody who wants to dive in.
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue, and a lot of money is going to be directed towards decarbonization and resilience, over this next period, and already is, from the federal government. And the question is, what is that money going to be used for? Is it going to be used to help people remain, or is it going to be used to, retrofit buildings that people will be evicted from? A lot of, things like new green, new bike paths, and, kind of like nature kind of greening of neighborhoods. It has been connected to the gentrification of neighborhoods as well. So I think, we all want better neighborhoods. We all want greenery, tree canopy, et cetera, but, we want the people who live there to be able to remain and enjoy it. I think one of the problems right now is that, there's so much emphasis on building retrofits and resilience, but the focus has mostly been on large buildings, and so much of our housing stock in Boston is smaller buildings. And then the smaller buildings, often are owned, have been in disrepair, especially they've been owned by working class families. And it's not that you might have old wiring that needs to be upgraded. So until recently, there really were not resources for that kind of work. The City of Boston just started a pilot small building retrofit program. So I think that's a really good start. But I think, that is, we really need a lot more of that. And I think that the coining of the term environmental justice, and, supposedly I'm on the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. This is supposed to be a high priority for the Commonwealth right now. But we really need to see that come down in real life, in real dollars, in our communities that are struggling to remain, and that usually are also the ones who are most affected by cumulative impacts of pollution. I mean, Chelsea is the most, has suffered from the most different kinds of pollution, substation, you name it. Chinatown is the hottest neighborhood in the city of Boston, often 10 degrees hotter than other parts of the city because it's completely paved over. It has the lowest tree canopy and, is the intersection of two highways. So these are the neighborhoods that are most affected that really deserve to have the most investment of this kind of green infrastructure dollars. One of the projects that we're working on actually is a community microgrid, and we're working on this with the Resilient Urban Neighborhoods, which is a fantastic group of technical people, and the Green Justice Coalition on microgrid projects in Chelsea and Chinatown specifically. And the goal there is, for us in Chinatown, we're particularly focusing on multifamily affordable housing, trying to decarbonize, allow for renewable sources like solar to contribute, and batteries to allow buildings to power on and off the grid. that, not only is it a financial challenge, it's also like a lot of these projects and the things we're trying to do are pretty new. And so our regulatory systems are not set up to allow for this. And our utility monopolies are not, sorry.
I just want to take advantage of all the nodding. There's so much nodding, so pick up on the nods.
Yeah, so I think at the Housing Authority, we think a lot about this intersection of climate change, gentrification, and housing, because in many ways, public housing is a resource that allows communities to stay in place amidst change that is happening around them. And I think we are kind of trying to think creatively of how to take advantage of this moment where we're talking about things like retrofitting buildings and decarbonization, because it makes things like replacing windows and stoves like sexy. And that's what we've been trying to do all along. And so we are really trying to jump on that train and use it so that it's benefiting the folks that are most deeply impacted by rising, like sea level rise, and we're going to get hotter for longer periods of time. Like, who's going to bear the brunt of those changes that are happening around us? And we've also spent a lot of time thinking about there's what we need to do to our housing stock, both existing and thinking about new, but also thinking about who's doing that work, how are we building pathways for folks to actually participate in a green transformation, and really creating pathways for public housing residents, but also non-public housing residents as well. I'm all here for all communities of color and all low-income folks getting good jobs and being able to stay in the city of Boston. But I think having both the mindset to what do we need to do to our buildings, but also who gets to be involved in that work and change. The city created this program called Power Core. It's based off of a model that started in Philadelphia, but it's a green jobs training program that's really focused on getting communities of color into different green career pathways. And that's something that I see as really heartening, that we should be doing more of that much more frequently than we currently are.
So Kathy and Mike, I'm going to invite you to pick up if you want to, but pause for a second. Somewhere out there are people with microphones, yes? Where are you? Okay, so we have a couple people with microphones. Please start thinking about if you have a question for the panel, and a couple of people can feel free to raise your hands so that our people with microphones can start making their way to you, while I get one more thought on this from Kathy and or Mike.
So I would just add, this is all great stuff. Our mayor is very committed to this issue. And one very important thing is how climate justice activists are working with housing activists and community activists to make sure.
Kathy, move your mic a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Housing justice activists working with climate activists, environmental justice advocates to make sure that there are protections when there are these investments in private buildings, because that's, just kind of stating the obvious, but in terms of how people would get, unless there are protections put in with these programs, tenants will be evicted, as Lydia spoke to before. That was.
Thank you. Last thought, Mike?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, so if you're not from Boston, you probably flew into Logan Airport. Logan Airport, beautiful airport, pretty good airport, if I say so myself. And also there's even this huge, development plays into climate resilience and environmental justice really strongly too. There's a whole really fascinating history about the history of Logan Airport in East Boston, this neighborhood that's largely Latino, working class, has historically been more affordable and is quickly turning not into that. And an expansion of airport. And so you can't think about, carbon footprint and environmental justice without also thinking about the built infrastructure, including airports, and also one last plug around public transit. You can't expand, build more housing without good public transit. And, unfortunately, we've been in a cycle of divestment and scramble to make it somewhat rideable. The train regularly catches on fire here. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but also kind of not.
Funny, not funny.
Yeah, no, that's real. And I'm thrilled that, we have some exciting, the Green Line has been extended up in, in the north side of the city. That's exciting, and also it's the least capacity line. And so just thinking
and misbuilt.
And well, I didn't want to go there, but but yeah, we have a lot of work to do just in terms of our built environment, in addition to and including housing.
Thank you. And such an important dimension to add to the conversation. Do we have questions out there? Do we have a first hand raised? Sir.
Okay, thank you for a wonderful discussion. I've learned so much in a short space of time, so thank you. My train home tomorrow is at 11 o'clock in the morning, and this is rally is at 3 o'clock, so I have a problem, and I need to try and do something about that. If I can't, I just want to throw a couple of things out there that may help with the struggle against the struggle for rent control. There are very powerful interests you encounter, I'm sure you know of them, which are trying to say that rent control is a terrible thing. And I think these arguments collapse pretty quickly when you point two things out. And I'm probably telling you stuff you know already, but here's just some important things, I think, which I found useful. The first one, which I find useful to respond to usually kind of mainstream, even right-wing economists who say rent control is a terrible thing. The first one I tend to reply with is, if deregulation has been such a brilliant idea, why are we in this mess? Right, and they usually don't have a response to that. So that's the first one. The other one is, people always say, who are opposed to rent control, they say, rent control harms supply. And it's actually against the interest of tenants, because if supply is affected, that means prices go up. And then you think, well, hang on a second. If landlords and landlord lobbies are saying that they don't want prices to go up, and this is why I find it really important just to throw that back out there, because then the arguments collapse. And so if I can't make this rally, I just wanted to throw that out there in case that's useful, because I'm going to try and change my train time. The second thing is, you mentioned urban renewal, and there is a piece of research which is one of my all-time favorites, and I haven't heard it mentioned during the conference, and it comes from Boston. 1963, there was a clinical psychologist called Mark Freed, who wrote a beautiful piece called Grieving for a Lost Home. And it was published in a book called Urban Renewal, the Record and the Controversy. And I mention this because one of the things which he pointed out is not only what's at stake in respect of the expropriation of use values, but he pointed out that attachment to place is incredibly important in a struggle to stop this kind of activity. And when I last read this article a few years ago, it seemed profoundly prescient and relevant to many of the issues we've addressed today. And I think so I was really encouraged to hear this conversation about use value and exchange value. And it's about these place attachment, it's about these use values that I think sometimes if we go back to scholarship done well over 50 years ago, 70 years ago, we can really learn some things which are just as relevant now, and they came from this very city. So it's just a couple of things.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of people, when they talk about urban renewal, they think of the West End, but actually there was a neighborhood that was raised before the West End, and that was Chinatown and the New York streets, and Mel King writes about that. And I have been working, one of the projects that the Chinatown Community Land Trust is doing, because we're not just doing housing, but we're trying to preserve and stabilize the whole future of Chinatown as a neighborhood, and that has many different strategies and aspects. And one of the things we've been doing is calling for Chinatown's preservation and development as a historic and cultural district, which has always anchored immigrant working class families. So I've been going and doing oral history interviews with people who used to live in Chinatown, and I just hit this trove of Lebanese residents, you know, because it was a concentrated Lebanese community, but shortly before the Chinese, and then Chinese and Lebanese lived together. So, and everybody, but whether they're Chinese, Lebanese, or whatever, whenever I interview old timers, they are so nostalgic about the community as it existed before urban renewal. Everybody sat on the stoop, everybody watched each other's kids, it was a wonderful time, everyone got along, and then after urban renewal, whole communities, you know, displaced and then just facing a wall, followed by becoming zoned as the adult entertainment district. So it just totally destroyed that strong community for decades. And one of the things that we're trying to do as a community land trust, it's not just preserving homes to be permanently affordable so that people don't get displaced, and that in and of itself is a really important goal, but it's also permanently affordable resident-controlled housing. So that sense of resident control, I think, is really important to people's peace of mind, to people's stability. And part of what that means, too, is that when it's, and there's no such thing as a single-family home in Chinatown, okay? The smallest buildings are 2, 3, 4-story, 5 units. So if people are permanently there and they're part of a condo association or they're part of a cooperative building, they're working together with the community land trust and they have to deal with each other, each family on a floor in order to figure out, when does the roof need fixing, do we need to get pest control? Over time, you see that start, and we're still just at the beginning of this, but you start to see people's relationship to the community and the neighborhood changes. Because just within their own building, they're starting to work together, they're starting to get to know each other. They're figuring out how to talk to each other through Google Translate if they don't speak the same language. And then it starts rippling outward because they start talking to their neighbors and like, hey, why did you leave your trash on my door?
Yeah.
It's different when you talk to each other. So I think that in a way, we're also rebuilding that sense of community by doing that.
Let's try to grab one over here. Here,
Hi.
we're all ready.
Hi. Ooh, I'm stuck. I'm going to stay seated.
That's why you can stay down there.
I asked this question yesterday of an academic panel, so I'm going to ask it again. I'm curious if you can talk about the role of public schools and the role of youth in organizing. And I was taken with your comment that if we need to think about housing, we need to think about climate, we need to think about transit. We also need to think about schools. And the comment about the pipeline question. Where are youth or high school students kind of in that pipeline, both from a facilities perspective for schools, but also obviously an educational perspective, and then kind of a youth and youth organizing perspective?
Jump
So if, I think that's a great question. I mean, the young folks are just so critical to movement generally. And there's this really interesting podcast I've been listening to. You may have heard of it, called the Big Dig podcast, put out by GBH. And in it actually talks about, the first episode is about defeating the highway. There was a moment where there was a plan to be a big highway coming through the city. And one of the things that happened was people organized young folks to go down to DC and protest against the highway. At least that's what the podcast episode talks about. And I think, given the intersections of all this stuff, of affordable housing, of climate justice, of transit, and of schools, it's just, I wish I could say I was optimistic, but we've really struggled, as politically struggled. In the last couple of years, there was a huge, massive effort to put a ballot question that would have raised taxes on the very, very upper income folks with annual income over $1 million. It was a surtax. And by doing this, we would raise billions of dollars of resources to be put toward transit and education. And as soon as we pass this, and as soon as we're getting ready to be like, okay, how can we invest in our schools? There's a huge tax break that's given at the state level. And so much of that money that people had worked and canvassed and voted for, and that was an investment in the future of the Commonwealth, was just doled out to people who didn't need the money. And so this is a political crisis just as much as a financial one or an economic one. And I think young folks, I think youth, historically in social movements have played a really crucial role, and I think it's a really big an important question to wrestle with.
So Taylor, we have about 2 minutes left, and I just haven't heard your voice in the last couple of Q's and A's. So let me ask you if there's anything on that you want to pick up on, and if not, I'm going to give you last word on wherever you want to go.
Yeah, so I actually think in terms of I can't talk about public schools, that is definitely not my wheelhouse, but in terms of young people and their role in the housing authority, I actually think at first blush you wouldn't anticipate that we would think a lot about young people at the housing authority, but we do, because we have such a strong focus on resident participation and resident organizing. Like, we have a monitoring committee that is comprised of residents that have to sign off on all of our disposition decisions. And in addition to that, we have a resident advisory board that is advising us on policy and programmatic decisions that we're making. And recently we've thought about, well, if we look at the folks that live in public housing, many of them are young people. Where are their voices fitting in these structures that we've built for resident participation? So I think we're thinking a lot about how do you build that kind of next generation of resident leaders, starting with young people and kind of investing in them and their voices early, so that one of the great things about the Housing Authority is we've had resident leaders who have been around for like 30 years, and we want those like 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds to be those resident leaders. Like, maybe I'm still at the Housing Authority, maybe I'm not, but I want them to be the ones at the tables making those decisions.
Thank you very much. I think that's probably the right place for us to end. If you would join me in thanking our panelists.